in the Charlottenburg district of Berlin, Germany. In a 3-story house at 43 Marienberger Alley, an elderly couple sat listening by the radio. In her time, the wife had given birth to 8 children, 4 boys and 4 girls. The second son had been killed in the First War, and 27 years later, a second war would take 2 more boys from her. The husband was the most prominent psychiatrist in Germany. They had both opposed Hitler from the beginning and were proud of their sons and son-in-law who had been involved in the conspiracy against him. They all knew the dangers. But when the war at last ended, news of their 2 sons was slow to arrive in Berlin. Then, a neighbor told them that the BBC would the next day broadcast a memorial service in London. It was for Dietrich.
To fulfill in us that other word with which Dietrich concluded his obituary of Heimat. While in God confiding, I cannot but rejoice. And ye shall be brought before governors and kings for my sake, for a testimony against them and the Gentiles. Take no thought how or what ye shall say, for it shall be.
Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a man determined to do the will of God, radically, courageously, and joyfully, even to the point of death. It's a life framed by a passion for truth and a commitment to justice on behalf of those who face implacable evil. The study of Bonhoeffer's life and the writings he left behind reveal a story of deep faith that is as relevant for us today as it was 70 years ago. This is the legacy of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Pastor, martyr, prophet, spy. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was born in the first decade of the 20th century, a decade that saw the birth of great scientific, transportation, and industry innovations, the first flight of the Wright brothers, Einstein's theory of relativity, and the introduction of Henry Ford's Model T. The next 10 years continued the hope and promise of the previous years as we looked into space to discover Halley's Comet and down to the smallest particle to reveal the atom. But a dark cloud had settled on Europe, and the assassination of Austria's Archduke Ferdinand was the spark that ignited World War I. And when the war to end all wars finally ended in 1918, over 16 million soldiers and civilians had lost their lives. For America, the 1920s was a carefree time of speakeasies, the Charleston dance, and jazz music. Everyone was enthralled with talkie movies and Babe Ruth's home run record. But on the other side of the ocean, Germany was reeling from the severe restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles. And in 1923, the same year Bonhoeffer starts his college life, a small group of ardent German nationalists, led by a young, charismatic radical, tries to take over the reigning German government. The coup fails, but the young radical is well on his way towards his quest for power. His name? Adolf Hitler.
From the time I was 13 years old, it was clear to me that I would study theology. I am now studying here in Tübingen for my first semester, where I took the customary step for every dutiful son and became a hedgehog.
This room is the great hall of the famous historic Igel fraternity. Igel, I-G-E-L, is the German word for hedgehog. This is the frat house where Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a member when he was here at Tübingen University in 1923. Bonhoeffer's father, the great Karl Bonhoeffer, who would become the most famous psychiatrist in Germany, one of the truly great scientists of Europe, he was a member of the Igel House in 1888. And it was part of the family history, Bonhoeffer family history, that all the boys would follow in the father's footsteps and spend their first university year at Tübingen. As far as Karl Bonhoeffer was concerned, he wanted his children to use their great minds to think clearly. It's not enough just to be smart, you have to use your brain correctly. And he trained them to think logically, to know the difference as a scientist, because of course he was a great scientist, to know the difference between a fact and a non-fact, between evidence and non-evidence, and then to follow the logic rigorously, almost ruthlessly to the end, not to be sidetracked by emotions. And so that's part of the family culture, to think clearly and to put a high value on academic learning. Now, this building was not built till 1902, but the fraternity began in 1871 when many of the other fraternities right here in Tübingen began. Germany had just been formed. They had, of course, won the Franco-Prussian War, so there's this sudden nationalistic identity of Germany, and lots of the fraternities took up this nationalism. But the Igel fraternity, in a way, stood in opposition to that. And they almost mocked it by taking the eagle, the hedgehog, as their mascot. And instead of the bright colors of the other fraternities, they took 3 shades of gray, so almost no colors as their colors. So there's kind of an irony here. And it's not really an anti-nationalism, but a sort of a skepticism toward the overblown nationalism that you saw happening in 1871. And if you think about it, that thinking follows the Bonhoeffer family, because they were always at some distance from what became a kind of a hyper-nationalism in Germany, especially during the Third Reich, always standing a little bit outside, very proud Germans nonetheless, wary of where that pride could lead them, which, as we know, was to a place that was not so wonderful. And so he came here to Tübingen to spend the year studying theology. By all accounts, he was a brilliant student from the beginning, but something happened to him while he was here studying at Tübingen, which ended up changing his life. It was that winter of 1923, I think it was the end of January. One day, while he was skating, he took such a bad spill that he cracked his head on the ice and was unconscious for quite a long time. When his mother and father heard about this, they raced all the way from Berlin, very long distance by train, to come to be with their son. We can only guess that because their third son, Walter, was killed and they did not rush to his bedside, they thought he would get better, and of course he died. This time they would not make that mistake. So they raced all the way to Tübingen to be with him. And so they spent some time with him, he recovered, everything was fine. It ended up being his 18th birthday, so they had a really wonderful 18th birthday celebration with him while they were here. And it was during this time that Dietrich Bonhoeffer got this crazy idea about possibly spending a semester in Rome. And he introduced his parents to this idea.
I received all sorts of magnificent things for my birthday. Papa had given me 50 marks for anything else I wanted, so I bought a guitar, and I'm very happy about it. And just so you won't get over your astonishment, I'll tell you about the next completely unbelievable occurrence. Just think, it is possible that next semester I will be studying in Rome. Papa still thinks that I really should postpone it. Nevertheless, after thinking about it, I want to do it so much that I can't imagine ever wanting to do it more than I do now. Best wishes, and don't be too envious.
Now, as parents, being parents, don't really want their son to go to a foreign country for a long time. It was a long trip in those days, it wasn't a short flight, and so they're not so keen on this, but he's kind of working on them. And then finally they agree to let him go if he'll go with his elder brother, Klaus. Now, Klaus is about 5 years older. So Klaus goes with Dietrich to Rome, and for him it's just really, it's the mind-blowing event of his life. He can't believe he's getting to actually go to Rome. And when he gets there, he is taken not just with the classical world, because of course that's everywhere, but also with the church. And on Palm Sunday, he goes to St. Peter's to see them celebrate the Mass, okay? This German Lutheran goes to St. Peter's to see the Mass. And on the altar, he sees for the first time something he's never seen.
The universality of the Church was illustrated in a marvelously effective manner. White, black, yellow members of religious orders, everyone was in clerical robes united under the Church. It truly seems ideal.
He sees these different races, these different ethnicities, these different colors celebrating this seminal Christian moment on Palm Sunday. And it gives him a vision, visually, of the church, because we have to remind ourselves what he's covering as a student, what he's studying is this big question, this heavy theological question: what is the church? And here he is, just 18 years old, and he sees in front of his eyes a picture of the universal church. Now, it's not just Catholic while he's Protestant, but it's interracial, it's multinational. This really grabs him because it makes him think, he was already rather a cosmopolitan person, raised in Berlin by academics, many Jewish friends, so he didn't have a really parochial German nationalistic vision of the church. But in a way, for the first time, he sees the Church of Jesus Christ in this universal way. And it really gets him thinking about this question: what is the church? What exactly is God's idea of the church? On this question of what is the church, he ends up getting his doctorate at the very impressive age of 21. Hard to believe, but true. In the course of answering this question, what is the church, he decides that he loves the church itself. So he doesn't just want to be a brilliant academic theologian, which he was and intended to continue to be, but he also wanted to be ordained as a Lutheran minister in the Church of Jesus Christ. So it's an extraordinary thing that he's brilliant enough, that his mind and interests are capacious enough to want to do both. You could not be ordained in those days until you were 25. So at age 22, he decides to spend a year in Barcelona, Spain, as the assistant vicar at a German-speaking congregation. He picks up Spanish in like a weekend. You know, he had that kind of a brain. And then at age 24, he decides to go to New York City to study at Union Theological Seminary, but mainly for the experience, I think, of being in New York. And again, in these places, you get the idea that in Spain, and then in New York City, he sees the church beyond the Lutheran German church. His cosmopolitan upbringing and this rigorous tradition of thinking clearly, thinking things through to the end, gives him this idea clearly that the church is something more than just the German Christian church. He's thinking beyond national lines about what is God's idea of the church.
The Church is the Church only when it exists for others, not dominating, but helping and serving. It must tell men of every calling what it means to live for Christ, to exist for others.
It's interesting because Bonhoeffer was not afraid to question things. And so when you get to the issue of what it means to be a German, you realize that as the years went on, this became more and more serious. And so this sense that Bonhoeffer was always considering both sides of an issue, and I think it's a challenge to us to do the same thing. What does it mean if we fall into a rut of thinking, if we say that, okay, I'm a conservative, and does that mean that we begin rejecting ideas that would come from the other side, from the liberal side, out of hand? Or do we ever think that maybe we can learn something from the other side? You get the idea from Bonhoeffer that he was always willing to think things through rigorously, to never reject anything out of hand. He was never an ideologue. So you get the idea of his idea of the church and the idea of Germany as being a really pure search for the truth. What is God's idea of Germany? That was really his question. Ultimately, this would lead him to reject Hitler to reject National Socialism, because he wasn't saying, I'm rejecting Germany. He wasn't praying for Germany to lose the war because he hated Germany. He was praying for Germany to lose the war because he loved Germany, but he loved God's idea of Germany, and he knew that the Nazis were taking Germany in a hyper-nationalistic way away from the great Germany that he knew growing up. So that constantly exists as a tension in Bonhoeffer's life, in his search for the truth.
During the second half of the 1920s, the Nazi Party grew rapidly, gaining strength through political office and intimidation by Hitler's stormtroopers. This rise of nationalistic fervor had even wormed its way into the heart of the German evangelical church. A movement emerged within the ranks of the church called the Deutsche Christen, or German Christians. These German Christians embraced many of the extreme nationalistic and racial aspects of the Nazi ideology. And once the Nazis came to full power early in the 1930s, this group quickly pushed for the creation of a National Reich Church, a Nazified version of Christianity.
The government that denies protection to the Church thereby places the Church all the more patently under the protection of a master. The government that blasphemes the master testifies thereby all the more evidently to the power of this master, who is praised and glorified in the torments and martyrdoms of the congregation.
Okay, so the question is, what does this mean to us today? Couple things. First of all, this idea of the search for the truth. Am I just accepting tradition? You know, Lutherans did this, so we're going to do this. Or are we to constantly be looking back and saying, well, what did the first century church do? What did Jesus do? What are we to do? Bonhoeffer had the confidence, I think, not just being brilliant, but being raised in this extraordinary academic family, this culturally sophisticated family. He had the confidence to be willing to question things. But again, not to question just to question, but to question to say, well, what does God say? I'm not going to be bound by mere tradition. Maybe there's some places where the tradition has gone astray. We have to constantly be questioning what is true. And so Bonhoeffer was willing, in a way that almost no one was, to really think through what is the church. I'm not going to just accept things. And I think that speaks right to us.
The designation Catholic or Protestant is unimportant. The important thing is God's Word. God's Word will never be denied, whether it be preached by us or by our sister church. We adhere to the same confession of faith. We pray the same Lord's Prayer, and we share some of the same ancient rites. This binds us together, and as far as we are concerned, we would like to live in peace with our disparate sister.
Bonhoeffer also took very seriously the idea of what is the church, and we have to think about that too. Do we think of the church, in our case, only as my church is the church, it's the only real church? What does God say about His church? What are the non-negotiables for God? You may disagree with someone, you may have theological differences with someone, but does that put them outside God's church? That's really challenging for some people, but we ought to be challenged. We ought to think these things through without any fear, but just with the courage and the faith that God says, I'm interested in your knowing what is true, not just what you've heard or what's been given to you. This is something we can learn a lot from, and so for me, Bonhoeffer, he really is the ultimate example.
To confess and testify to the truth as it is in Jesus, and at the same time to love the enemies of that truth. To face our enemies unarmed and defenseless, preferring to incur injustice rather than to do wrong ourselves, is indeed a narrow way. If we regard this way as one we followed in obedience to an external command, if we are afraid of ourselves all the time, it is indeed an impossible way. But if we behold Jesus Christ, going on before step by step, we shall not go astray.